You're listening to Blood in Bohemia, a Czechast special series.
I'm Vít Pohanka.
And I'm Rob Cameron.
Two journalists cutting through the murky thicket of Czech history, where murder and power have long walked hand in hand.
Let's step into the shadow.
So, Rob, let's start with a bit of a replay today. In the two previous episodes of Blood in Bohemia, we've talked about the Second Defenestration of Prague in 1618 and the execution of 27 Bohemian noblemen in Prague's Old Town Square in 1621.
We did indeed. And both events, of course, took place during arguably the most dramatic period in Czech history. The early 17th century was a time of religious conflict, political rebellion and war. And as we've already said in previous episodes, what began as a dispute, perhaps even an obscure dispute between Protestant nobles in Bohemia and their Catholic Habsburg rulers, soon escalated into the 30 Years' War. And that, of course, was a conflict that engulfed much of Europe and left large parts of Central Europe, the lands around us, completely devastated.
Absolutely, and let us reiterate also that the Battle of so-called White Mountain
or White Hillock
in 1620 crushed the Bohemian revolt and marked the beginning of profound changes in the Czech lands. The old non-Catholic elite was driven into exile or stripped of its property. Political power shifted to those who were loyal to the emperor, and war became, for a time at least, a permanent feature of life for an entire generation.
And if I understand correctly, Vít, if there's one man who seems to embody that very turbulent age, it is a guy called Albrecht von Wallenstein, or Albrecht z Waldsteina in Czech. And now I am wondering whether to say Wallenstein or Wallenstein, because ever since I've lived here in the Czech Republic, I've taken to saying Liechtenstein when many of my fellow citizens, I think, would say Liechtenstein. So now I don't know what to say. So what are we going to call him? Wallenstein? Let's sort that out before we start the episode.
Let's call him Wallenstein.
Okay, let's do that.
With an S, even though the Germans would pronounce him Wallenstein. And the Czechs would talk about him about Waldstein.
Yes.
But before we went to the studio, I think, Rob, we can mention that we discussed, he's this kind of figure. The name Waldstein is so omnipresent.
It really
Prague,
is.
and
it's something that you see, tourists will see his name everywhere because, of course, many are drawn, especially in these hot summer months, when they visit Malá Strana in the center of Prague, to Waldsteinská zahrada, the Wallenstein Gardens. They're beautifully peaceful. They are the gardens that surround the building of the Senate.
That's right. There are exhibitions or photographs from time to time.
Outdoor concerts and that sort of thing. So it's a name that lots of visitors and locals see, but they never really think about the man. So who was the man? He was a military commander. He was a businessman. He was a political operator. And he was one of the richest men in Europe. And at the height of his powers, he commanded armies numbering tens of thousands of men, and he wielded influence that sometimes rivaled that of kings and princes.
That's right, and that actually became the reason why he ended his life violently, or his life ended violently, as we will get to that. I have to say, Rob, I've always thought that Wallenstein, I will use this name, was a fascinating figure because in many ways, I believe his life reflects the opportunities, ambitions and brutal realities of the 30 Years' War itself. He rose from relatively modest beginnings to become the emperor's most powerful general, only to end his life murdered by his own officers, or his hired officers, I should say, in the town of Cheb, or Eger, as the Germans would call it, in 1634, as we will again discuss later. But before we get to that dramatic ending, who exactly was Wallenstein? I asked historian Jaroslav Čechura.
Albrecht Eusebius Václav z Valdštejna byl významný český šlechtic, který
Albrecht Eusebius Wenceslas von Wallenstein was an important Czech nobleman. Although we remember him primarily as a military commander because of his role in the 30 Years' War, he was above all an entrepreneur, and in many ways he was a remarkably modern one. He was able to raise and equip large armies for the emperor, which earned him enormous prestige and favor at the imperial court. As a result, he rose to the rank of generalissimo and accumulated ever greater honors and titles. At the same time, however, there was an element of hesitation in his character. He often struggled to make decisive choices as a military leader. That was probably connected to the illness that afflicted him in the final years of his life. He suffered from syphilis, and the disease appears to have contributed to increasingly irrational decisions. Nevertheless, Wallenstein remains one of the great figures of Czech history. It is telling that in the famous Valhalla Memorial near Regensburg, which honors distinguished personalities of German-speaking Europe, Wallenstein is the only Czech to be included. He was very much a man of his age, someone who knew how to seize every opportunity to advance his career and amass immense wealth.
But you know, Vít, from what I knew, which was not much, about Wallenstein before we started working on this episode, I always thought of him primarily as a military man, a military commander, one of those larger-than-life figures from the time of the 30 Years' War, a man, you know, leading huge armies across Europe into battle.
And that's, Rob, certainly how he's remembered today. But what's interesting is that Wallenstein's rise to power didn't begin on the battlefield. It began actually long before the 30 Years' War in a Bohemia that was still Protestant and where religious identity was often far more complicated than we might imagine today.
Because Wallenstein, this great Catholic figure, himself wasn't actually born a Catholic, was he?
No. He was born in 1583 into a Czech Protestant, well, what we would call today Protestant, but at that time simply non-Catholic noble family, associated loosely with the unity of the brethren. He lost both parents at a young age. He was educated first at Protestant schools. He traveled widely across Europe, and only later he converted to Catholicism. And looking back, I think it's tempting, Rob, to see the conversion of Wallenstein as a kind of simple career move. After all, the Habsburg rulers were Catholic, as we did mention a few times before, and Wallenstein would eventually become one of their most trusted commanders.
But life in Central Europe at the beginning of the 17th century, it wasn't quite that black and white, that straightforward.
Not at all. The lines between faith, politics, family interests and personal ambition were often blurred. And this was an age, I think, that confessional identities were hardening, but it was also a world in which noblemen frequently changed their religious allegiance. Some did so of genuine conviction, others saw it as a practical decision in a rapidly changing political landscape.
Can we form an allegory, perhaps, in pre-Brexit Boris Johnson being a great Remainer when he was mayor of London, and all of a sudden Brexit happens and he's this big Brexiteer? Do you think there are parallels there?
I think there are very numerous parallels, and especially since we are talking now in Prague, in Czechia, a lot of people changed their allegiance from the Communist Party to other parties after 1989, and even our president, I mean, let's mention that, Petr Pavel, who's presently president of Czechia, was a member of the Communist Party.
Absolutely.
He's not anymore.
And something for which he is obviously endlessly criticised by his opponents.
Yep,
absolutely.
And they definitely try to use it as an opportunist.
Yeah.
But definitely, coming back to Wallenstein...
Who was an opportunist, maybe.
Who was an opportunist, definitely. He was an opportunist, there's no doubt about that. But there was another important factor. Through his mother's family, the powerful house of Smiřický, Czech nobility, he stood to inherit wealth and connections that would help launch his extraordinary career. So, as historian Jaroslav Čechura explains, both his conversion and his family background played definitely a crucial role in his rise.
On se narodil do doby, kdy vlastně je poměrně časté, že ti šlechtici, a nejen šlechtici, konvertují.
Wallenstein was born into a period when it was quite common for members of the nobility, and not only the nobility, to convert from Protestantism to Catholicism. For some, these conversions were purely opportunistic, while for others they reflected a genuine change of conviction. I think Wallenstein was above all a pragmatist. He also benefited enormously from his family background. His mother came from the house of Smiřický, which was the wealthiest noble family in Bohemia at the beginning of the 17th century, and Wallenstein eventually became one of their heirs. That gave him an exceptionally strong financial foundation. Combined with his conversion to Catholicism, it provided him with everything he needed to become one of the outstanding figures of his age.
Prostě to byl špičkový muž své doby.
So we've said that he was an opportunist, but listening to that, Vít, it seems, or it's tempting to think that Wallenstein's rise was mainly the result of being in the right place at the right time.
Well, timing certainly helped, but wealth and connections alone don't explain how he became one of the most powerful men in Europe at that time, without any exaggeration. Plenty of noblemen inherited fortunes, of course, but very few managed to transform themselves into indispensable figures at the imperial court, as he did.
And this is where we get to what may have been Wallenstein's greatest talent, right?
Exactly. When the 30 Years' War broke out, armies were growing to unprecedented sizes. Kings and emperors needed soldiers, officers, weapons, horses, food, and of course, money. And they needed them quickly. And Wallenstein understood that better than almost anyone else.
Amateurs fight wars with tactics and professionals fight wars with logistics. Or something like
exactly.
That, something like that. There is some phrase about
that's...
logistics. But in other words, he wasn't simply a general waiting for troops to be handed to him.
No, far from that. He was able to build armies. And as you mentioned, I mean, logistics were extremely important. I mean, you needed
even
money,
in the 17th century.
You needed transport even then, I mean, as always. So he was able to recruit soldiers, to equip them, finance them, and first and foremost, he was able to keep them in field. So in many ways, he was running one of the largest and most complex organizations in Europe. And that's one reason why some historians see him not just as a military commander, but as a remarkably modern figure. And again, as historian Jaroslav Čechura explains, Wallenstein's real genius lay in his ability, I think, to organize people, money and war on a truly massive scale.
Existuje takový italský slovo, který se jmenuje condottiere. To znamená...
There is an Italian term, condottiere. It refers to the leader of a mercenary army, a military entrepreneur. Interestingly, Bohemia had a long tradition of this kind of professional soldiering. After the Hussite wars in the 15th century, the profession of the career soldier emerged here in what we would now consider the modern sense. Wallenstein excelled at recruiting soldiers and officers. They were mercenaries, men who fought for pay and were often willing to change sides and serve under different banners. That was perfectly normal in 17th century Europe. Wallenstein understood this system better than almost anyone else. Above all, he was an outstanding organizer. Today, we would probably describe him as a brilliant manager who knew how to make the most of the opportunities his age presented.
Dokázal maximálně zužitkovat.
But from what I know, Wallenstein wasn't actually at the Battle of White Mountain, right? And yet, when people talk about the aftermath of that most consequential battle, his name seems to be everywhere.
That's true. White Mountain is often seen as a turning point in Czech history, as we mentioned before again. But the defeat of the Bohemian revolt in 1620 transformed the Czech lands. The old, let's say, non-Catholic elite lost power. Many nobles were exiled, again, as we mentioned before in previous episodes. But what is truly important, vast estates, property changed hands. It was a moment of enormous, not only political and social, but economic upheaval.
And Wallenstein somehow managed to turn all that upheaval into an opportunity.
Exactly. And again, according to historian Jaroslav Čechura, that's one of the keys to understand his rise.
On se nezúčastnil bitvy na Bílé hoře.
Wallenstein did not actually take part in the Battle of White Mountain. At the time he was in western Bohemia, capturing towns in the service of the emperor. But he was quick to take advantage of the political vacuum that followed the Habsburg victory, when the old Protestant ruling elite was being replaced by a new Catholic one. He used that moment to remarkable effect. Before long, he was appointed military commander of Prague, and from there his career advanced rapidly. Eventually, he was able to raise and command an army numbering many tens of thousands of men. So, simply put, Wallenstein did not become famous because he was a brilliant battlefield commander. He became famous because he was a military entrepreneur. And that, I think, is the key to understanding who Wallenstein really was.
To je klíčový pro Wallensteina.
That's a really interesting and perhaps very modern way of looking at it. Most people probably think of Wallenstein as a great military commander, but Professor Čechura is saying that his real talent was spotting opportunities and knowing how to exploit them. So, by the late 1620s, Wallenstein wasn't just commanding armies, he was also, at the same time, becoming one of the richest men in Europe.
He definitely was, and I would say, Rob, that this was the beginning of his fall, because much of that wealth came from the dramatic changes that followed the Battle of White Mountain, and as the non-Catholic nobles were stripped of their estates, vast properties became available for purchase or redistribution, and Wallenstein proved exceptionally skilled at acquiring them and, in a way, becoming too powerful for his good.
Okay, too powerful for his own good. Interesting. And that power base was where? What, in northern and eastern Bohemia?
Around the town Jičín, which is now a very picturesque kind of small town.
The base for visiting Český Ráj, is it?
That's right, yeah. Very close to Český Ráj, which is... Český Ráj is partly in central Bohemia, but also Hradecký kraj. So it's coming kind of northeast of Prague. I mean, that's where it is. And over time, Wallenstein assembled a huge territory centered around the town of Friedland. Have you ever been there?
I've never been to Friedland, no.
The Germans call that Friedland, and we call it Friedland too. Now I think about it, they just write it differently. It's in northern Bohemia. It's kind of northeastern Bohemia. And what had begun as a collection of estates, individual estates, I would say, gradually evolved into something much more ambitious. Wallenstein wasn't simply collecting land. He was literally building a political and economic power center of his own.
Almost like a state within a state.
That's exactly, at least, how some of his contemporaries saw it. And that's why he became dangerous for them. He established his own administration, encouraged trade and manufacturing. He must have been very energetic, because we are still talking about a 30 Years' War. So there was a conflict. Yet, at the same time, Wallenstein was able to order building. I mean, he wasn't building roads himself, of course, but his people, I mean, the people who lived on his land, that they had to build roads, expanded towns. And as I mentioned, he chose his capital as Jičín, this town, I think it's about 50 miles northeast of Prague.
And it sounds like he had big plans for it.
Very big plans. Wallenstein wanted Jičín to become the center of his dominions, and he envisioned a grand residence, churches, even university there.
Right, so he wasn't just accumulating wealth and titles. Wallenstein was also leaving a very visible mark on the 17th century Bohemian landscape.
That's right. And he managed to do that within basically one decade, in the 1620s. And if you want to understand the scale of his ambitions, you only have to have a look at the project he launched in places like, I mentioned, Jičín, but also Prague. And historian Jaroslav Čechura believes they reveal something important about the man himself.
Chtěl, nebo měl plán, že Jičín bude sídlo biskupství jednou, že tam bude...
Wallenstein had ambitious plans for Jičín. He wanted it to become the seat of a bishopric one day. He envisioned a magnificent city with grand buildings, parks and formal gardens. You can still see traces of those plans today. In many ways, Jičín was intended to become the capital of what was almost a state within a state. So yes, I think it's fair to say that Wallenstein was trying to build a state of his own. Just look at his extraordinary building projects. The best example is the Wallenstein Palace in Prague. It was built during the 1620s at the very height of the 30 Years' War. Yet, despite the conflict raging across Europe, he somehow managed to obtain everything he needed and completed this magnificent palace in record time. It still stands today as a testament to his extraordinary ambition and organizational ability.
Prostě vybudoval.
Well, listening to all this, I think not only is it time for for me to visit the town of Jičín, where I haven't been for about 20 years, but also it's not difficult to see why some people might have become uneasy about Wallenstein's power and wealth and enormous influence.
You are absolutely right. As I indicated, just think about it from the emperor's perspective. Here was a man who commanded enormous armies, controlled quite vast territories, possessed immense wealth, and was building what looked increasingly like his own power base in Bohemia. And everything that made Wallenstein useful also, I think, made him potentially dangerous.
And this was, of course, an age when rulers tended to be very suspicious of powerful subjects.
And for good reason. The 30 Years' War was still raging. Alliances were constantly shifting, and loyalty could never be taken for granted. Perhaps we should mention, since this is part of Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech, can you guess where a lot of the soldiers, the mercenaries, actually came from?
Germany? Oh, is that a bad guess? I don't know.
A lot of Irish and Scottish.
Irish
actually.
and Scottish?
Scottish, yeah. They were fighting here in Central Europe, and they were mercenaries. They were quite famous for that. And as we will hear in a minute, they were actually the authors of the violent death of Wallenstein.
And I wonder how many of them left perhaps some of their DNA in the Czech
I wonder too.
Politic. Yeah.
So definitely what we can say, Wallenstein had become so influential that foreign rulers and diplomats treated him almost as an independent political player rather than merely an imperial commander.
And so was the emperor genuinely afraid that Wallenstein might turn against him or something?
I think, Rob, that's the great historical question from what I understand from my reading and speaking to Jaroslav Čechura. Certainly, the emperor really thought, that he could turn against him. By the early 1630s, Wallenstein had begun negotiating with various parties in the war, including Saxony and indirectly Sweden as well.
He sounds like a kind of a Prigozhin figure to Putin, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, he was something like that. That's a very good point, actually, just thinking about it. Very useful for some time, but then becoming...
Very good at logistics.
Very good logistics.
Militarily quite skilled.
Nevertheless, becoming...
Ruthless.
Ruthless, but becoming dangerous to the ruler himself.
Yeah.
So... Well, definitely what we can say is that Wallenstein supporters argue that he was just trying to find a way to end the conflict that had already devastated much of Central Europe by the negotiations, alleged negotiations with the Swedes. But his enemies definitely saw something much darker.
And what was that?
That he was preparing to abandon the emperor, the Habsburg family, basically, perhaps even carve out an independent position for himself. We think about Europe now in, set borders and everything.
Which didn't exist then.
But they didn't exist then. And Germany wasn't unified. There were so many little states. It's kind of understandable that, he definitely seemed to be dangerous for the emperor. So whether that was really his intention might remain a matter of debate. Historians are still arguing about it almost 400 years later. But
even that suspicion that he was planning something like that can be a very dangerous thing, right?
Very dangerous indeed, especially in the 17th century. In 1630, Ferdinand II, the emperor, had already dismissed Wallenstein once under pressure from Catholic princes who feared his growing influence. 2 years later, after a series of military setbacks, the emperor reluctantly brought him back simply because he needed him.
It already sounds like something of an uneasy relationship.
It must have been. The emperor needed Wallenstein's talents, but he no longer fully trusted him. And Wallenstein, for his part, seems to have become increasingly frustrated with the imperial court. The relationship was beginning to unravel.
And eventually, the emperor decided that he'd had enough.
Yes, and by early 1634, Ferdinand II had reached a dramatic conclusion, we can say. Wallenstein was stripped of his command and declared a traitor officially. Suddenly, the most powerful man in the empire found himself isolated, and officers who had once depended on his favor were forced to choose between loyalty to their commander and loyalty to the emperor.
And then what happened after that?
At that time, he was in Western Bohemia. He left Pilsen, where he had a kind of a base. He left for Cheb, or Eger, as the Germans would call it. And then the accounts differ in some details, but they agree on the essentials. Wallenstein was basically unarmed, and he was attacked by his own officers, chiefly one of the Irish officers who actually killed him, because already there was a kind of conspiracy against him. And some reports say that he rose from his bed when he was attacked in Eger and faced the intruders. Others claim that he stood silently with his arms outstretched.
Right, it's quite a haunting image, almost as if he knew that, okay, time's up, then there's no escape.
Perhaps in any case, the confrontation lasted only moments in the final act. Devereux, which was the name of of one of the conspirators, he stepped forward and thrust a partisan as it's called, a type of spear, into Wallenstein's chest, and the most powerful man in the empire after the emperor himself was dead.
A feature of our previous podcasts has been the scant level of detail that we've had about the various fates that our protagonists met. So it's remarkable how much detail historians seem to know about what happened to Wallenstein that night.
And that's one of the most fascinating aspects, I think, of the story. And historian Jaroslav Čechura explains why.
Tam je strašně zajímavý to, že známe spoustu detailů, co se tam dělo díky tomu, že...
What's really fascinating is that we know so many details about what happened that night. Ironically, that's because the emperor neglected to pay the assassin. He complained that he had carried out the deed, but never received the reward he had been promised. Thanks to that complaint and the documents it generated, historians have been able to reconstruct the assassination in remarkable detail. The account was written by the Irish officer who took part in the killing.
Ten průběh exekuce.
That's fascinating. So one of the main reasons that we do know so much about Wallenstein's murder is that the assassin had a claim and wanted to get paid for what he'd done.
That's right. It's one of those strange, I think, ironies of the history. The killer's frustration became a gift to future historians. Thanks to the records he left behind, we can reconstruct one of the most famous political assassinations of the 17th century in extraordinary detail.
And with that, one of the most extraordinary careers of the 30 Years' War came to a very bloody and abrupt end.
Yes, but the arguments over what Wallenstein had really intended were only just beginning. Was he a traitor who got what he deserved, or was he the victim of a political assassination ordered by a ruler who had grown afraid of his own general? Nearly 4 centuries later, historians are still debating the answer.
I mean, we started this episode, dissing him a bit and talking about him as an opportunist. But listening to the story, it's hard not to be impressed by Wallenstein. I mean, he did rise from relatively modest beginnings to become one of the most powerful men in Europe. Although it also does feel as if he was constantly pushing his luck in the same way that Prigozhin was with Putin.
I think that's a fair way of putting it, and I'm really glad that you came up with this kind of parallel of Prigozhin. I just wonder what Wallenstein would do in the time of social media, whether he would be active as well, as Prigozhin,
no doubt,
etc. He was undoubtedly very talented, and I think he kind of proved that he can adapt, to the changing situation for at least a period of time between 1620 and 1634. A man who helped shape the course of the 30 Years' War, only to be cut down by his own officers in a small border town on a winter night in 1634.
And that was the end of Wallenstein. But there's one thing, Veet, before we go, and it's something I've often wondered about, and it's a question I've asked you on several previous podcasts, and you've always pointed out that it's difficult to say, but as we've said, in English and German, he's usually known as Wallenstein. In German, probably Wallenstein. In Czech, he's Albrecht von Wallenstein. But do we know what language he actually spoke to the emperor, to his men, to his friends, to his family?
Well, I think the short answer is he spoke both Czech and German. When he spoke to the emperor and to his friends, he probably spoke German. He was definitely born in Bohemia and grew up in a world where Czech and German existed side by side. And his mother came from a powerful Czech noble family of the Smiřických, as I think we mentioned. And some historians believe Czech may even have been his stronger language as a child. But he also operated in a vast Central European world that stretched far beyond Bohemia. So to make career in the Habsburg monarchy, he certainly needed German, and he must have used it extensively. So his surviving correspondence is overwhelmingly in German. He also spoke Italian, by the way, and Latin, and probably had at least some knowledge of other languages as well, because, as we mentioned, he used mercenaries, from countries as far away as Ireland. Even though I wonder, the Irish would have spoken English at that time, mostly.
I think they would have spoken Irish at that time, but then they must have had a lingua franca, surely.
Yeah. Well, we should definitely remember that 17th century Bohemia was a multilingual society. There were large German-speaking communities throughout the kingdom, and language did not necessarily define identity of the in the same way as it often does today. You could be a Bohemian nobleman and speak German. And in fact, when I checked the Encyclopedia Britannica this morning before coming into the studio, Wallenstein is described quite simply as and now I quote, a Bohemian statesman, soldier and aristocrat.
Which is yet another reminder, as if one were needed, that it is futile to attach 20th century ethnic and linguistic labels to figures before about 1880, because people simply didn't consider themselves strictly in those terms until what we would call the modern age. You're frowning.
I'm frowning because I'm now. You mentioned before 1880.
Well,
yeah, I know.
I just picked a date and went with it.
I'm not quite sure whether I ever mentioned that, but did you know that my grandfather's mother was German-speaking?
No, I didn't.
In Vysočina, and she lived in a village in the Vysočina region, which is in the heart of Bohemia.
Of course.
And Czechia, what is now, it's not in the heart of Bohemia.
And the biggest town, Jihlava, which is a very German place before, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And my grandmother, great-grandmother, she actually lived to the 1960s, I think, and she never spoke Czech very well, as I learned. But since she married a Czech-speaking person long before First World War, even, she was able to stay. She wasn't considered German when the expulsion of Germans-speaking population happened in the big cities
In 45 and 46.
So what am I?
Indeed.
I wonder.
Why? What are any of us, Vít? But I think Bohemian statesman, soldier and aristocrat is a fitting way to remember Wallenstein.
Of course, I definitely agree. And perhaps I would add and even stress that his life ended again violently in the town of Cheb in the west of the country. And that is why his story, I thought, was definitely fit for this Blood in Bohemia series.
You've been listening to Blood in Bohemia, a Czechast special series.
With Vít Pohanka and Rob Cameron.
If this journey into the shadows intrigued you, follow the show, leave a like, or pass it on to someone who loves history.
Your support helps us uncover even more hidden chapters of the Czech past
on Czechast.